Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this ACRL Project Outcome webinar titled, as Gina mentioned, Evaluating Library Instruction at 2-year and 4-year institutions. Briefly, I'll introduce our collegial team working on this research project. Katie Miller is the head of the Student Learning and Engagement Department at UCF Libraries. Her MLIS has led her down a number of paths, including corporate librarianship, project director of a Title V grant, and teaching and advising students in college success skills courses. Rachel Edford is an instruction and engagement librarian in the Student Learning and Engagement Department at UCF Libraries. She has a PhD in English and an MA in Liberal Studies, in addition to her MLIS, and taught college composition and literature courses at Seminole State College of Florida for 6 years before joining UCF Libraries in 2019. I'm Karen Kaufman, a research and instruction librarian at Seminole State College of Florida and adjunct professor teaching research strategies for health science in the Bachelor of Health Science program. I have a PhD in information science and an MLIS. My research focus is information literacy and user relevance, specifically sociocognitive relevance, meaning what is useful and meaningful to the user. So welcome. Next slide, please. In this webinar, we will talk about our experience using Project Outcome in a cross-institutional study. Our institutions have an established articulation agreement between the college and the university called Direct Connect. Students with an AA degree earned from the Direct Connect Partner State College have a direct transfer pathway to the University of Central Florida. Due to this partnership relationship, there's an interest in learning about the information literacy instruction that is provided at both institutions in the first years, and potentially reflecting other partner college information literacy instruction context. Your institutions may have a similar transfer student articulation agreement, providing for transfer student pathways. It is important for us to learn how and if there's a variation in student perceptions at the different institutions and how we might more intentionally align information literacy instruction for transfer student preparedness and success. To that end, we'll talk about the way we have used Project Outcome and certain elements that guided our study. We'll introduce ways this collaborative study uncovered opportunities, how our planning for the study evolved, how we implemented the Project Outcome survey across the institutions, and where we are with planning to analyze the data. Next slide, please. So this slide intends to provide a snapshot of our institutions and provide a comparison, both similarities and differences of our institutions in order to provide some context. Seminole State College of Florida offers 4-year bachelor degrees, but primarily has been or migrated from a community college to a state college in Florida and has been offering 2-year AAS degrees, specialized career certificates, and continuing professional and adult education. We offer over 200 degree and certificate programs. We serve over 25,000 students, and about half of our students are minorities. We're also a designated Hispanic serving institution. The University of Central Florida is a 4-year metropolitan research university, having over 230 degree programs and serving 70,000 students. They also serve minorities. About half of that student population are minorities, and they too are a designated Hispanic serving institution. Next slide, please. Seminole State College is one of 6 Direct Connect state colleges to the University of Central Florida. The benefits associated with the Direct Connect partnership includes guaranteed admission to the university with an articulated AA or AS degree from one of the partner colleges. Almost half of the 70,000 UCF students are transfer students. One of the many advantages for transfer students of the Direct Connect partnership is that Florida has a statewide course numbering system that facilitates more seamless transfer of credits for transfer students to UCF from the state colleges. Next slide, please. So in this study we propose fills a gap in the research. The literature indicates that most cross-institutional studies of library instruction programs at academic libraries consist of surveys about assessment approaches and methods, rather than comparing student feedback on information literacy across institutions. The references to this literature can be found on the references slide at the end of the presentation. To more easily deliver the project outcomes survey at both institutions, we determined to use Qualtrics software, which UCF has readily available, with the intent to upload our survey data to Project Outcome to use some of its great features, such as benchmarking by Carnegie class. Project Outcome dashboard allows one to easily compare student feedback across institution type. We anticipate using the features of the Project Outcome dashboard to be beneficial when we start to analyze the survey data. These features may assist with understanding how information literacy instruction at our different types of institutions could be more closely aligned for transfer student progress in a timely manner. Katie is now going to talk about our planning stage.
Thank you, Karen. Next, as Karen said, I'll be sharing our planning process. So once again, we really want this to be a interactive session, so don't hesitate to raise your hands to ask a question or put a question in the chat as we go along. We would like this to be as interactive as possible. Moving to the next slide. So the first step in the planning process was to understand how library instructions worked for each of us. At the University of Central Florida, we follow a subject librarian model, where a librarian is dedicated to a specific discipline. Subject librarians here focus on upper divisional and graduate level courses, whereas instruction for the first and second year students are handled by the Student Learning and Engagement Department. Because we focus on the first 2 years, much of our work in student learning and engagement mirrors the work of our colleagues at Seminole State. As Karen mentioned, transfer students make up almost half of the student population, so many of them will come to UCF having already completed those gen ed requirements. For us, like many academic libraries, one of our few opportunities to connect with students falls under a one-shot instruction. And due to our size, we only reach a small percentage of the population. Typically, our instructions include an orientation to library services and an introduction to searching the library databases. They are scheduled at the request of the teaching faculty and frequently accompany a specific assignment. All of these factors are barriers to creating a more cohesive information literacy program. Next slide, please. After gaining an understanding of how we teach information literacy, we examined our previous assessment methods. On the screen is an informal method using note cards that my colleague Rachel Edford used after her instructions. Before we discuss ourselves, we'd like to take a moment to know how you currently assess library instructions at your institution and any barriers you may have. So we'd like to do a little Padlet activity. In the chat, I'm going to go ahead and place this link so that you can go ahead and, oh, you got it? Thank you, Rachel. And when you get to the chat, when you get to that link, Rachel, if you can show the Padlet activity. We're going to have 2 questions, one of which is how are you currently assessing library instruction at your institution? And what are the barriers to implement formal assessment or that you imagine you might encounter? So some people have already started putting it in the chat. If you haven't noticed, you can hit the plus sign. So most people are doing many of the same things that we do. Some people are using project outcome. Some people don't have a formal assessment method. Some people have that 1-minute reflection paper. In terms of barriers, what we're seeing is some of the same things that I mentioned previously: inconsistent student participation, low staffing, that's certainly an issue, lack of buy-in. I'm guessing from lack of buy-in, you're probably talking about maybe from both the faculty and from the librarians themselves. Yeah, lack of interest from librarians and faculty. So let's see if we can scroll down. Not enough time in the sessions. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit. Assessment is intimidating, so I don't know who said that, but absolutely. Some people are doing surveys through LibWizard, nothing formal. It's up to each librarian. So as you can see, just like we experience, it's kind of all over the board in terms of what people are doing. We want to thank everyone so much for including this. We'll go ahead and capture all of these thoughts and include them with the materials that we send out as part of the webinar. So let's talk a little bit now about what we actually experienced as part of our study. So if we could go back to the presentation. So just like many of you said, prior to project outcome, we both tracked the number of sessions and attendees. And like some of you mentioned, we used a form in LibInsight. The assessment was at the discretion of the librarian and it varied. It listed many of the things that you guys shared in the Padlet. So Seminole State actually began a little bit sooner than we did. They began piloting project outcome surveys in the fall of 2020. And they use both the immediate and the research surveys. They are now in the early stages of developing a formal information literacy program, which includes an overall description of the program, student learning outcomes mapped to the framework, and they are also aligning those with the college strategic plan. They're also working on common assessments, marketing, and integration. We look slightly different here at UCF. In the summer of 2021, Rachel and I both piloted using Project Outcome's immediate instruction survey. And this was really just because we were interested in trying out Project Outcome and learning a little bit more about it. But it was sort of a happy accident because this work laid the foundation for that same survey to be used for all library instructions. This adoption was something that was triggered by a university audit at UCF, which recommended we have more formal assessment methods. Moving to the next slide. So now we had to take those study design considerations. Although we could have surveyed all of the courses which received an instruction, we wanted to eliminate as many variables as possible when comparing student satisfaction, at least for this first go around. One of the courses that we found that consistently requested library instructions for both of us was ENC 1102 or English Composition. We hoped focusing on this class would give us the largest sample size and allow us to limit the modality to face-to-face. Now, in the state of Florida, you might think with that common course numbering system that the courses would have the same structure and be fairly uniform. However, they're slightly different at the institutions. The UCF course incorporates both primary and secondary research methods, and the papers focus on writing studies topics, whereas the Seminole State course focuses on secondary research of literary works. Finally, we identified which librarians would participate in the study. And after establishing this scope, we were ready for the next step. So that dreaded institutional review board. In many cases, securing IRB approval, it can seem a bit daunting. However, I found that there were a number of benefits to be had when you're undergoing this really kind of important step in publishing your research. So in a nutshell, going through the IRB process will bring increased clarity and focus to your project. You need to be able to clearly express to someone who is outside of the library world what you hope to learn and why. It forces you to map out all the nitty-gritty details. And I mean all the details, including the timeline. You have to create all of the artifacts for the study in advance, and you have to determine how this will be marketed to participants, just to name a few things. But I found going through this process really affirms that you are asking a question that's worth investigating, and it forces you to have a concrete action plan. So with that being said, there are a couple of things you need to know regarding this process. First, the IRB process might vary by different institutions. That was certainly the case for our study. If you are conducting a cross-institutional study, see what the approval process looks like on both ends. We decided to host the study here at UCF, and Karen coordinated with IRB at Seminole State. In our case, we learned that Karen was required to undergo additional training by UCF to be included in our study. We had to identify how this survey would be administered, and as Karen mentioned, we decided to go with Qualtrics for a number of logistical reasons, and then upload the results into Project Outcome after the end of the term. As with most things, one of the things you need to do is to set aside time. You want to make sure that any additional clarifications and edits can be approved in a quick manner. So I responded to the questions and made revisions as soon as possible, which really helps speed up the process for us. So I would highly recommend making this something that's a top priority in your workflow, because you don't want to be stuck in that IRB loop waiting for those approvals to come in. And finally, it is good to remember that you're conducting a study, not a certainty. So always keep in mind that you can learn from results that are unexpected. So next, I'd like to have Rachel take you through the implementation of our project.
Thank you, Katie. So I want to talk a little bit more about coordinating across our institutions, some of the issues that we ran into during the rollout, and then some lessons learned. So in terms of the timeline, as Katie said about, it's really important to make sure that you do budget enough time. Our final IRB approval came mid-December, which can be a challenging time for us in academia, as that's kind of the end of the semester and when we're going on winter break. So we knew beforehand that we really wanted to have everything set in place for the beginning of spring semester. And we had already gotten at our institution some library instruction requests for the spring. So we knew at least in mid-December that our first session was scheduled towards the end of January at UCF. But it's also, I think, worth noting, I think, as I'm sure most people on this webinar have experienced, that it's been really hard to predict instruction requests these last 2 years with the pandemic. So that was just kind of something that we also kept in mind, that even though we had these plans, that they were going to do things a certain way, just with how things have happened the last 2 years, it was hard to say for certain we would get this number of requests, or we would even get this number of face-to-face requests. So just being aware of that and being kind of flexible with things. So also, try to make sure that we had our responsibilities all assigned. We actually decided to set up a team in Microsoft Teams, since we were all familiar with working with that, at our various institutions. And it was particularly helpful for collaborating and sharing documents and just doing chats and setting up meetings. And in terms of responsibilities, we divided it up that Katie was going to handle all of the Qualtrics survey. So just monitoring how that was going, also downloading the results periodically so we could kind of keep up with what kind of data we were actually getting. And then Karen and I handled communicating with our various stakeholders, which included the faculty who were teaching the course, department heads, and then other librarians, who would be actually administering the survey. So in terms of communication, this is where I think both Karen and I drew on our experience working with these various departments and figured out what we thought would be the most effective method to get the information out. And I know with my experience, sometimes direct emails to faculty are not always the most effective. So I worked with our composition program liaison, who is a composition faculty member, but she also is the one who kind of does all the scheduling. So I worked with her to craft a message that she sent out to the faculty, thinking that they'd probably be more apt to read something, from more of their superior than from me directly. Karen worked directly with the Dean of English at her institution because she had already let him know about the study and worked with getting a message, and then he sent that out to his various faculty members. And in terms of the librarians at Seminole State, I think Katie mentioned we are a very small department. So even though we have 4 members, it was really going to be Katie and I who were doing the bulk of the instruction. So we were able to just explain the study to our colleagues just kind of in other meetings. Karen had more work to do with that because she was working with both full-time librarians, so 2 full-time librarians, 2 adjunct librarians across 3 different campuses. So that obviously required more coordination and more specific instructions about the process for actually administering the survey. And speaking of administering the survey, I wanted to include here, this was the slide that went through the whole IRB approval process, and that in the course of our instructions, as we were introducing the survey, this is what we would project on the screen. And you can see all the information on here. It's a very text-heavy slide that has purpose of the research, eligibility. And then what was nice is we also had in the notes section for all the librarians who were administering this, basically a script that everyone would say the same thing to introduce the slide and introduce the study and help to create some consistency, again, across librarians and across institutions. So that was the first slide that we would show. And then after we kind of explained, here's what the study is, then we gave them the survey URL, and we were collecting some additional information aside from what's on the standard project outcome survey. So that was also included on this slide. And in this one as well, there was a little script at the bottom that just said, thank you for your participation. And these we shared in teams. So again, that made it very convenient for us to kind of coordinate with things. All right, and as Katie mentioned too, yeah, so we filled out this for each course section. That's what we're kind of keeping track of course section. Again, you can use kind of the project outcomes in any way that works for your institution, but for our purposes, we were doing it essentially by course section and then professor and librarian. So in terms of the rollout itself, I was actually the lucky one who got to do the first session. And I did my library instruction. I think it was probably like a 50-minute session, and I left like 5 minutes at the end because that's what we had determined on the IRB slide. Even in the instructions, it says, this survey will take approximately 5 minutes. So I said, okay, I'm going to leave about 5 minutes. So I pulled up the intro slide, explained the survey, passed along the survey URL, and I started to notice as students were pulling out their phones that they were having some trouble inputting the survey URL. And just to go back to the slide, one, it's rather long, and then 2, the other thing that I don't think we noticed is it's actually really difficult to tell here with the font, like what's a letter, what's a number, is it lowercase, is it uppercase? So students were having a hard time, and I actually was having a hard time kind of advising them as to the correct URL. So in a later session, because I had multiple ones that day, I just printed out strips of paper that had the URL kind of in a larger and different font so they could read it a little better. But we decided as a group, to improve the usability of it, that we would just create a QR code instead, and also created a short URL using bit.ly, but then found out, unfortunately, at Seminole State, where Karen is, that their internet doesn't allow students to use bit.ly addresses. So again, just some of the challenges sometimes of working across different institutions and knowing that those things might come up. So something else that to me seems like a bit of an issue was timing. Like I mentioned, I left 5 minutes at the end, but that slide with the survey information, right, is very text heavy. And I like to explain a little bit about, what the survey is and give them time to do the survey beforehand. So I just found that the amount of time to do it properly was much more than what I had anticipated. In terms of communication, so I think the faculty, right, had already gotten the communication through their various means, but I always like to, even at the beginning of a session, before it even started, just touch base with faculty and say, hey, we're doing this survey. Is it okay if we leave some minutes at the end to do this? Is there anything that you need to do to wrap up the session? And same thing with the students. I always like to give an agenda and let them know, oh, I'm gonna ask you to do a survey at the end, just kind of a heads up with that. Another thing I found a little bit challenging sometimes is, as someone who hasn't done a lot of formalized assessment, right, I had those note cards earlier, is how do you kind of connect this formal survey to what you've been doing in your library session? And this is where I was actually pretty lucky with the composition faculty did it for me. As we said earlier in the presentation, in the college composition courses at UCF, they actually do primary research in addition to secondary research. So as I pulled up the survey and I started talking about it, she's like, oh, look, Rachel's doing primary research, which is exactly what I'm asking you to do. So kind of thereafter, that was a really nice segue saying, we've been talking about secondary research, but here's an example of a primary research method and a way that you can help participate in that for our university and for our Direct Connect partners. And then lastly, another thing to think about are just eligibility requirements. This was another thing that came up that I don't think we initially, thought of. So Seminole State College has a large dual enrollment population, meaning they have students who are under 18, and for our participation requirements, students actually had to be at least 18. So they unfortunately were not able to participate in the survey. So that was kind of an unexpected thing that we had. And then lessons learned. So just some things to keep in mind for those of you kind of doing this in the future, or if you've had experience with this. First off is to leverage your existing relationships. I mentioned both with Karen and I, and how we decided to kind of get the information out to the faculty, knowing are the faculty more apt to read emails from their dean or from a coordinator or from the librarian? Is it better to go to a department meeting and present on it? What's the best way to do that? So kind of knowing your institutional, your department culture can be really helpful. And then I also put on here to do your homework, and I put a screenshot and I have the URL, which I can pop in the chat. I was going to pull it up on the screen. So Project Outcome has a really nice page of resources, which I think we found really helpful. So let me pull that up real quick. Oops. Get out of my slide. Okay. There we go. So this is the Project Outcome resources, and I can pop that in the chat. And just basically from your homepage, right, you go up to the resources tab. So some of the things in particular that I found helpful, because I don't really have a big research methods background myself, is the data collection. So there's information about sample size, survey best practices, even about choosing the right survey for whatever it is that you're trying to assess. But the thing I wish I had read, there's some case studies here, which I was reading those probably a couple weeks ago after we had already started doing the survey and had our data. And this one in particular, the Closing the Loop, which is about a first-year English composition, mentioned having some issues with the long URL. And so just as a piece of advice, like there's really good information here. So if you're embarking on this using Project Outcome, it can be really helpful just to check out the resources that are already there. So let me just go back here. And then just one final little tip here. And I like, what Katie said about that this is a study, it's not a certainty. I think just being flexible, about things and realizing that it's impossible to plan for everything that could possibly happen, and to just go with it and know that, most people are pretty forgiving about things if you explain, what it is that you're doing, why it's important, why you think it's important. So just trying to be flexible and open to opportunities, I think is kind of a good piece of advice. And then with that, I'm actually going to turn things over to Karen. She's going to talk more about analyzing our results and kind of the next steps.
Great, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Katie. So yeah, so where we are is we have actually a nice little swath of survey results. We have a good bit of data, and it's been collected in Qualtrics. And so now we're going to be working to develop a methodology for the analysis of those results. And so given that we are using one platform, as we've mentioned, Qualtrics, to administer the survey, and Project Outcome to assist with the analysis of the survey, there are steps of the analysis process that need to be sort of clearly identified at this stage and explained in order for a solid methodology of data analysis to be determined. And so each of the platforms, both Qualtrics and Project Outcome, provide different but beneficial analysis tools, which we'll need to review and then determine which will be best to use for this research project. So considerations such as, as Rachel mentioned, how are people using Project Outcome, looking at those case studies and those other resources, but also recognizing that Project Outcome is a validated survey instrument. And there's a lot of value in using something that's already been tested and validated. Qualtrics is also a valid survey instrument, but provides more of the statistical tools for us to capture analysis like standard deviation, frequency, and other statistical features that help to explain the results of the study. Project Outcome provides additional tools such as benchmarking across institutions, word cloud, and impact correlation analysis that has additional explanatory and descriptive analysis for both the quantitative and qualitative data. We also want to use research to inform methods of analysis. We've mentioned that we see this research to provide a focus on a gap in terms of assessment research for libraries. And so we also want to be sure to use a lens that supports our communities of practice. And so as a cross-institutional study, there are things for us to sort of sit back and consider now. And so that's part of our analyzing results next step. So next slide, please, Rachel. And then finally, generally, next steps, considerations at this stage. We want to, beyond the data analysis, which is going to be super exciting, actually, to take a look at and see what we find. Excuse me. We want to review what we've learned, some of which both Katie and Rachel have sort of alluded to in this presentation. We also want to be looking for unexpected results and have a mind towards being sure that we're looking through a lens that doesn't miss perhaps results that are very important and but not necessarily expected. And then also simply analyzing this experience of a cross-institutional research project. Some of those items already Katie and Rachel have identified, and up to this point in our research, process, it's been pretty interesting. All the things that we've experienced and that we can sort of reflect on and be sure that are noted. And then also future potential options. So as already stated in our IRB approvals, were for administering the survey in on-campus classes. And perhaps we want to look at looking at online classes and maybe administering the survey in other courses. Also, maybe considering institutional changes that are going on at our institutions post-pandemic. I imagine many of us are experiencing some of that. Sharing also beyond the library with other stakeholders. Who else would be interested in learning about these results? And sharing, of course, with the immediate stakeholders, like maybe the Dean of English here at Seminole State College of Florida and the English composition, coordinator at UCF. And also, how can or does any of this data help to provide information for accreditation numbers and qualitative feedback that might be useful at an institutional level beyond the library? So those are just some future potential options that we're considering. And so I'm going to now invite Katie back to talk about a research checklist.
So now that you've heard a little bit about our experience, you may be interested in using the resources from Project Outcome to your own study. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this into the chat, or I thought I was going to drop it into the chat. It is, for some reason, it's blocking me from popping it in there, but we'll be sure to send this out with the materials. What we've done is we've created a checklist that can kind of help you walk through the process, and it highlights the key points from our presentation with those regular reminders to look at project outcome resources that might be helpful when you're developing your own study. And so finally, going to the next slide. So we wouldn't be good librarians if we didn't include all of the references we used in Project Outcome as resources. And next, we'd like to open it up for any questions that people have. So you can go ahead and raise your hand or put a question in the chat if you have any questions about our experience and how we can help you. Can we see the survey you used? Sure. Let me see if I can dig that up for you real fast. So that is not, I have to be honest, that is not a question that I was expecting, but let me see if I can pull it up. Here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you guys can see it. All right, can you guys see the survey on the screen? Hold on. How about now? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so what we did is, this is actually, what we did is we used the standard project outcome survey. It's the immediate instruction survey. We made a point of showing this immediately after, or giving the survey immediately after the class in the last few minutes, as Rachel said. And so we used this, like standard Likert, and then we just included 2 extra questions. We wanted to be very mindful of the resources by project outcome to saying to really limit those questions. So we selected what did you like most? What else could the library do to help you succeed in your classes? And please share one thing that you learned today. And then let's see. All right. What are your thoughts on the weaknesses of project outcome, or what you'd like to see improved in anything? So in terms of weaknesses, One of the things that was actually a question, I don't know if it was a weakness, but you can't do a cross-institutional comparison in the dashboard, which is one of the reasons why we decided to go with Qualtrics, because Karen has to upload her institution's results through her dashboard. We have to do it through ours. And so because we wanted to compare it across the two institutions, there may be a way to do that, but it wasn't really apparent to us. And so that's why, so that would be something that maybe would be interesting to pursue later. Karen and Rachel, do you guys have anything to add on that?
No, I think though, stay tuned for part 2, because as we start to get into the data analysis, just like we learned so much through these first steps of the cross-institutional study, from IRB approval, through the deployment of the survey, we're hoping to uncover some great ways that Project Outcome might be able to do this cross-institutional benchmarking. So we're in the exploratory stage, and we'll see what happens from that. So
yeah, and I would just echo what Karen said. I wouldn't want to say too much about it, just because I haven't had huge amount of experience with Project Outcome, just doing the small pilot and then our survey. So to see what kind of responses we're getting to, especially for the open-ended questions, that's what I'm really curious about. And the one that we added, because when we piloted, we just did the 2 that were already included in there, and then the new one is, what did you learn that was new? So I'm curious to see what the results will be for that. And I know we also had a question about IRB in the chat about if the survey results are not going to be published, do you actually need IRB approval?
I would definitely check with your institution on that one, but I really do want to reiterate, it is a lot of extra work, but as the person who led the IRB approval process, I feel so much more confident about what we did, because it really does force you to think things through and asks a lot of questions that I don't know if we would have considered on the front end. Like, have you done this, and do you have all your materials in? And then of course it's always beneficial if you do decide later you want to share those results externally, you've gotten that done. So even if it never happens, it doesn't mean it was a wasted effort from my perspective. I think it's something, to at least go through that process and be familiar about it. Because if you did get something really wonderful, you would want to share it with the world, and you can't go back in time and sort of redo that. So, and I was not necessarily of that mindset before I went through this process. I feel like, as someone who's kind of gone through it now and I understand it, I'm going to be better prepared to do whatever other studies we want to do in the future. And I don't know the answer to the question about including it in Project Outcome as external sharing. So that's a great thought, as kind of mentioned in the chat. I'd like to comment on the quote about not being familiar enough to know if there are other assessments available. I would say that one of the things, if I could go back in time, I wish, like Rachel said, I would have spent more time really reviewing the Project Outcome resources more carefully. Not because, because we're all so busy and we're multitasking and there's so many things going on. Having that time on the front end, I think would have been really, really beneficial, just to kind of see what the opportunities are. Do you guys have anything to share?
Yeah, I can speak to that question about tailored more towards applied learning than student perception. And really, my understanding of Project Outcome is it's really about the perceptions and the variation of their perception. So it isn't about the learning per se, but rather about the student perception, but that variation. Some of the tools, however, that are available, that on the qualitative side of Project Outcome, let me get the right name. impact correlation analysis, which you can see in the dashboard, your own dashboard. It isn't necessarily learning, but it does help reveal the way in which there are correlations between certain elements that the survey is looking to evaluate. And so it's not, though, to the direct answer, it's not about applied learning, but about perceptions.
Yeah, and that'd be my understanding too, right? Because it's all outcome based too, right? And just as a note too, we only use the immediate survey. So there is a follow-up survey that actually some of the other case studies have talked about doing both the immediate survey and the follow-up survey, which can be an interesting, way to look at progression of, if students actually think once they've done the assignment, has this actually helped them, right? Instead of immediately after. Again, that doesn't necessarily get to exactly applied learning, but that would get you a little bit more of that question of, how are they using the information kind of outside of just immediately?
Yeah, I can also say there's an instruction survey and then a research survey. And when I was doing some piloting and playing around, I actually take a look at them, because to me, the research survey for certain classes and the kinds of instruction that was done seemed to make more sense to use to evaluate student perceptions and versus the instruction. So just take a look at the questions, and of course it's it's a ready to go, which is wonderful, validated instrument, but that doesn't mean we can't use it for, as I mentioned earlier, our own community of practice. What makes sense for the kind of instruction you're doing, the kinds of courses you're teaching, all kinds of different ways in which the survey could be useful to get assessment data for the kind of work that you're doing. So for instance, I've used it to assess a session I do for a chemistry class. So you never know.
All right, well, if nobody has any further questions, I think that this concludes the presentation. We want to thank everyone so much for sharing some time with us this afternoon and letting us share our experiences. If you ever have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out, and we will be sure that all of the presentation materials will be sent out to the participants. Thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.